hailing from Egypt when you arrive and want to try and have a pop music or initially actually even a film career in France is incredibly problematic. So she tended to hide her Egyptian provenance in the late 50s in France and instead to emphasize her Italian connection. She spoke French with a heavily accented Italian accent, and she was given songs to sing which had Italian words in them, Italian titles, so Bambino, Come Prima, Romantica. So she initially became successful in France very much as a representative of sort of Italian exoticism and not Arab.
Welcome to another episode of the Quartertones podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Dr. Barbara Lebrun, who is from the University of Manchester. And rarely do we have academics or researchers on this podcast series. I'm very thrilled that, Barbara, you're here because we're here to talk about one of the figures that I am most fascinated by in the history of 20th century Arabic music, who is Dalida. So, Barbara, welcome to the series.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
So let me ask you a really basic question. Who is Dalida?
Dalida is a singer, a pop singer of the second half of the 20th century. She was born in Cairo in an Italian family. And mainly her career as a singer was engineered in France, from Paris, where she moved to Christmas 1954, to be precise, but then is in the following years, from 1956, really, that her music career took off really fast, in fact. And she started becoming, according to some accounts, France's best-selling commercial female singer.
What was her family doing? What was the Italian family doing in Egypt? Why was she born in Egypt?
She was born in Egypt as a third-generation migrant, in fact. Her grandparents had emigrated from Calabria in southern Italy in the late 19th century. And like many poor families from southern Europe, from Italy, from Greece, they accompanied, in fact, British control or British rule of Egypt when it was a protectorate under British administration. And a lot of Westerners, Europeans, were welcome to fix themselves in Egypt. So she didn't know Italy at all. Growing up as a child, she very much grew up in Cairo, in a very multi-ethnic district called Shubra. And she went to a local Catholic French-speaking school there, but spoke Italian in the home and spoke some Arabic with some neighbors in the neighborhood.
So if I met 15-year-old Dalida and I said to you, hey, are you Egyptian? What do you think she would say?
I think she would have said yes, that she was Egyptian, but she was also very much Italian. I think that within these migrant communities, there was both multilingualism by default for practical reasons, going to the market and so on. But there was, I think, also the socialization was also within an Italian, quite close-knit family network.
Yeah. I think her father was if I remember correctly, her father was a conductor. Is that right?
That's right. So he was a violinist with the orchestra of Cairo. But unfortunately, he died when she was rather young because when it was the Second World War, he was interned in a prisoner POW.
Prisoner of war, yeah.
Of war camp.
Wow.
For 3-4 years for the best part of the war. And after he's released, he was severely depressed and died very young. I can't remember exactly when he died, what year, but I think Dalida was maybe only 12 or 13. This is something that really affected her and the other siblings very deep.
So how did you get led to this? I mean, did you grow up obsessed with her? I mean, is she part of your musical landscape as a kid?
Not at all. Though I am French, so I grew up definitely knowing about Dalida, hearing her songs on mainly commercial radio, watching her on television, and she died tragically in 1987. But I also remember watching repeat of her televised performances later on in the 1990s, for instance. But as a scholar, I came to her rather out of curiosity and a lack of understanding, in the sense that my first book, my PhD about popular music in France, was very much about so-called indie alternative rock artists who define themselves absolutely against mainstream commercial success. Sometimes artists who, in a way, like Dalida, have also a multilingual transnational career. People like Manu Chao, for instance, I have written about his career, and about other French artists who are also Franco-Algerian, for instance, a band called Zebda, who is from Toulouse, or another artist called Rachid Taha, who also born in Algeria, had a career as a sort of Franco-Arabic sort of funky musician in the 80s, and then later on as an electropop artist. But these were artists who were very much kind of on the rock and indie spectrum of popular music. And so initially I was interested in kind of mapping out their careers, but also eventually it led me to understand that there was a degree of antagonism against what they thought was the mainstream, or especially in kind of journalistic discourse and audience interest in these bands. And what I lacked as a scholar, and eventually I realized what scholarship about French music lacked, was an actual clear awareness, understanding of how commercial careers are shaped. And I was looking for a female star because I had studied and written a lot about what turned out to be male artists. And I wanted to be interested in a female singer, and a female singer who epitomized success, at least within France. But ultimately, I stopped at Dalida because I thought she was somebody whose music I had never admired from a personal taste perspective. But I worked on her career and trying to understand how she became so successful in France. And I must say, I worked on writing a book on her for the best part of 10 years. And my opinion completely changed. And I have become rather fascinated by the appeal she has, but with such diverse generations of audiences, diverse ethnicities, so many different people seem to find her fascinating. And the particular kind of music she had, very romantic, sometimes very bombastic, very melodramatic, is something that I have eventually come to enjoy, but it was not my natural social and cultural milieu, if you like. I was more into the sort of raw rock, supposedly authentic aesthetic. But she develops another type of authenticity, which is remarkably lasting and effective and affecting for her listeners.
I mean, it's an understatement to say that France has a very fraught relationship with the Arab world. And the image of the Arab in France is at best a complicated one, at worst a very dangerous and destructive and sort of violent one. How did Dalida exist in the French imagination when she was rising to stardom?
So there are many different stages and a long evolution to the way in which she is conceptualized, understood, discussed as an Arab personality, at least in France, seen from Paris and from mainland France. And when she arrives in France in 1955, 1956, there's a big crisis with the Suez. The British and the French are fighting to keep control of the Suez Canal, while the Nasser and Egyptian nationalists are wrenching it off Western European control. So hailing from Egypt, when you arrive and want to try and have a pop music, or initially actually even a film career in France, is incredibly problematic. So she tended to hide her Egyptian provenance in the late 50s in France, and instead to emphasize her Italian connection. She spoke French with a heavily accented Italian accent, and she was given songs to sing which had Italian words in them, Italian titles, so Bambino, Come Prima, Romantica. So she initially became successful in France very much as a representative of sort of Italian exoticism and not Arab. But that gradually changed. Partly changed after 1967, after the 6 Days War, because France's own diplomatic relationships initially more towards the side of the creation of Israel and having France its own fraught decolonial wars with Algeria in particular. That really changed after 1967. The French tried to create stronger bonds with its former colonies, with Egypt, with the broad Middle East, and in a way, Dalida became consciously decided not out of her own interest, but in a way you could say she was instrumentalized, but also she became a very important tool for symbolizing a Franco-Arab friendship, that it was a possibility.
Yeah.
And so she started a bit later on from 1977 to record a handful of songs in Arabic. She had already been using lots of languages. She had actually sung 2 songs in Hebrew, she, sung a lot in Italian, did some recordings in German, in Spanish, etc. But turning to Arabic in the late 70s was also a real gesture of embracing both her roots in Egypt, which she started to acknowledge a lot more openly during interviews, with journalists. Through touring, she toured a lot in Egypt, in Lebanon in the 1970s, or after 75 it became difficult in Lebanon, but she also went to Turkey and Jordan, and yet releasing songs in Arabic was incredibly original in France at the time. Nobody else was doing it really. And apart from some North African artists really targeting an Arabic-speaking audience. Whereas she was targeting a non-Arabic audience as well as an Arabic one with Arabic songs. And it's a real opening symbolism that the Arabic language is open, is cosmopolitan, can be the language of pop music. And this is a sort of modernizing gesture that she's giving and has given to the Arab diaspora, not just the diaspora as well, people who've stayed back home, but that make her so emotionally important to the Arab world today.
Okay, I want to go back a little bit because I realized I skipped a bunch of different things. So I'm curious about just like, maybe let's go through her early years. So let's start with a basic question. What's her actual name, and where does the name Dalida come from?
Okay, so her birth name on the passport is Yolanda Gigliotti. The Gigliotti is a sort of diminutive word in Italian for the lily flower.
Mm-hmm.
It's the name of her parents and of her father. And she changed to Dalida once she had arrived in France in 1955. Initially, back in Cairo, she had modeled for swimwear. And she was a bit of a starlet, and she was really fascinated by Hollywood movies, which were often shown in.
Was she famous at the time?
No,
or
so
was she just
famous.
she was a working actress and working model, but
That's
she wasn't
right.
famous?
Yeah, she was, a young 17, 18-year-old trying to use her body because she could. She was very good looking and trying to find bit parts in small films. So in 1955, she played in 2 films, 2 very small parts, but one is Sigara Wakas by an Egyptian filmmaker called Niazi Mustafa. It's a Egyptian film about. So what I was going to say about her name, sorry, I am also saying too many things at once. But for that film, her pseudonym is Dalila with an L, like Sansom and Delilah. So initially her pseudonym was very much Dalila, and it's only once in France that it was swapped. The final consonant became a D. But I can go back to the film Stigara
Yeah.
Wakas if you like.
No. Let's. We'll come back to that when she gets to France. But so she does Cigaro Wacas, and this is the 1950s. So this is 1954, 1955. What happens next? How does leading up to her getting to France?
So in Cairo, she was spotted on the set of a film by a French film director, a guy called Marco de Gastin. The rush she had done for him was never actually released. He never managed to put the film together, but it was meant to be a sword and sandals kind of epic film with a majoritarily French crew, but shot in Egypt. But he was impressed by her physique, I suppose. And being French, he said, well, why don't you come to France? There might be a few roles available for you. And initially, from what I can understand from her biography, her official biographer, she didn't really write her own autobiography, is that this director paid for her one-way flight ticket to Paris. And she tried her luck, but was not very successful in getting some film parts once. However, in 1955-56 in France, the passion for so-called Mediterranean exoticism was in full swing. There was already a Spanish artist called Gloria Lasso who had a career as the voice of Mediterranean exoticism in France, singing with an accented Spanish voice. And a French music producer, a very savvy, business-driven, but jazz enthusiast producer called Eddie Barclay, it's a pseudonym. But Eddie Barclay spotted Dalida one night in a club where she was singing, in fact, a Gloria Lasso song, because he thought she was a brunette like Lasso. She could pass for a Mediterranean woman, being herself of Italian origin. And he thought he was going to take this woman and transform her into a successful singer. So not just Barclay was in business agreement with a very conveniently the co-director of a brand new commercial radio in France called Europe 1, which is still very big today. And Europe 1 was a non-state radio at a time when national broadcast was still centralized by the French state. So in order to broadcast, Europe 1 was just on the frontier between France and Germany, just outside of France, which meant that it could escape not censorship so much, but decide on its own playlist and play much more modern music that was heard within the more traditional state-run French radio. And that meant turning to jazz, turning to initially rock music, and just being more in control of the kind of artist you wanted to have a career and attract listeners with. And the co-director of Europe 1, Lucien Maurice, was in agreement with Eddie Barclay that this woman they had seen who looked a bit unprofessional in a way, trying to have a career either as an actress or as a singer in France, they could really do something with her. And in 1955-56, they actually arranged to change her in a way, to change her appearance. And they explicitly, and that's something that Eddie Barclay really says in his autobiography and memoirs, that he actively tried initially to remove traces of Oriental identity, what he perceived to be Dalida's excessive Oriental appearance. And for him, it was her preference for heavy jewelry, for long dresses, for long flowing hair. And he said, no, that won't do in France. We have to tame you a little. We have to make you appear a little bit more sophisticated and Parisian. And for her, they chose, in fact, with the wife of Eddie Barclay, giving her expert sartorial advice, they chose the new look by Christian Dior, which was a very tailored cinch, kind of cocktail dresses, a very upper class kind of sleek, neutral pattern dresses. And in her early TV broadcast, not many people had TV in France in 56, 57, but many did. And on stage, she wore very discreet small earrings or no earrings at all. She had very simple monochromatic dresses and tops, and her hair was often wrapped around in a chignon rather than left loose on the shoulders. And
Like
that was a way
don't
to
be the
convey
wild Egyptian,
yeah,
Italian, Arab. Like be a little whiter.
proper, kind of the idea of more civilized or more respectable understanding of femininity.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so is she an immediate huge success?
Within 6 months of her first record, yes. So her first records for Barclay are actually covers of Spanish and Portuguese songs in the summer of 1956. Much success then. But in October or November 56, Barclay and his team decide to have her record a song that had already won in Italy that summer a major festival. And I don't think it was actually the Sanremo festival, but another one. But that song in Italian was called Guaglione, which became Bambino in French. So they gave it French lyrics, reorchestrated the song, and gave it to sing to Dalida. She was not the only one to sing Bambino in French in France that year. There were, I think I counted some 16 or 18 parallel versions. It was incredibly banal to re-record the same song for different music labels in different genres, it's actually different orchestrations. But what was unique with the particular arrangements they chose for Dalida is to really emphasize the Italianness of the song by giving it in French an Italian title, Bambino, by having this title repeated throughout in the chorus, and they foregrounded a mandolin, sort of a little string guitar, Italian guitar in the arrangements, which didn't feature either in the original or in other parallel recordings. So her songs, her version of Bambino appeared to be coherent with her name, Dalida, her accented Italian voice in French, and the lyrics in it, the mandolin that we could hear, all that gave a sort of Italian package that could label Dalida as the new Mediterranean but Italian sensation.
So what is the reaction? So immediately after this comes out, she's a star, and
So
is she like?
Yeah, so there are actually 2 recordings of the Bambino track by Dalida with a new album, it was a new single cover in February 57. Is really from that point onwards, because the visually as well, it's important. People don't always have television. They would hear her song a lot on Europa, not necessarily see her perform on telly. And if you hear a song a lot on radio, then you go and buy it. And the record cover was also foregrounding an Italian identity with a sort of black and white neo-realist kind of vibe of a decrepit wall, and looking very much in sync with arty Italian culture at the time. And so from February 57, it was a huge success. So estimates vary, but the general agreement is she sold 7 to 8 million records of that single within 2 years, basically. It was a really fast and tremendous success in late 50s France.
Yeah. So, and by that point, before we move on, I want to just kind of underscore, I've always heard these myths, right? That at this point, that's such a global phenomena that it's even reaching the US. And I saw online, I want to see if you can confirm this or not, or if you've seen this as well, that Ella Fitzgerald tried to recruit her to the US and give her a record contract. Had you heard something like this?
I've never heard this when I was researching for my book, but I'd be very interested to hear
Okay.
where you find that information, but to verify it as well. I've never heard this before.
Okay, so if anyone's listening to this who has heard similar things, please leave this in the comments, because I've always heard this idea that there was interest even across the Atlantic in bringing her over in the U.S. and in Canada. Okay, so she's mid-20s, she's 25, she's breaking into France's pop culture and Europe's pop culture scene. This is 1957, so this is 10 years before 1967. What is the process? I mean, how does she feel about this? I mean, not that you knew her personally, but is there accounts that she was conflicted and she still had connections to Egypt? Her parents, did her family still live there? I mean, was she still back and forth?
She didn't travel much to Egypt once she arrived in France, but her family was there, from what I can understand, at least until 61, 62. And in one account, because she recorded a famous Hebrew song, Hava Nagila, in, I think, 1959.
Interesting.
And he was invited to sing in either Cairo or Alexandria in around then. It was still 59 or 1960. But her family received threats that if she were to arrive in Egypt and put that particular song in her repertoire, they would be trouble. They were threatened. And so she cancelled that visit around 1959-60. And it was only once all her family by that point was her mum and two brothers, had emigrated, one to Italy and her mum and younger brother to France, that she was able to resume her travels to Egypt.
It's interesting. It's because, I mean, you said at the very beginning is third generation Egyptian. So it's not like her parents were there on a work trip and, okay, I left my job. Well, it's time to go back to Italy. They'd been there since, early 1900s. That's a very distinct move away from a place that, three generations had lived there.
Yeah.
It's an interesting turn of events. Was it particularly traumatic for her, you think?
I don't know. The problem is Dalida hasn't left many personal accounts or self-written accounts of her life. And at the time, these are not questions that journalists would ask her, like how she feels and how she positions herself within a world that is undergoing decolonization and within an Arab world that now has to contend with the creation of an Israeli enemy. So these were not questions that music artists were asked to discuss when promoting their latest singles. In fact, popular music, and in a way its saving grace, appears to be often divorced from political preoccupations, even when it can be used as a symbol for diplomatic rapprochement, or it was obviously always politically loaded. But the artists themselves or at least in that time, were not asked to talk about very problematic post-colonial relations.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the myth of Miss Egypt. When did she get associated with this title and this mythology?
Yes, so it is true that in 1954, when she lived in Cairo, so she had participated in various modeling competitions. And in Egypt, there was the Miss Egypt competition, exactly copying the format of Miss Britain and Miss France that existed already, mainly in Western Europe and also in the United States and North America. My understanding, however, is that Dalida never participated, or at least never won, the Miss Egypt competition. She won for a second prize ex aequo a much lesser well-known beauty contest in June of 1954. It was called in French they call it the Miss Ondine. There was a English word for it. but it's Miss Bathing Costume, Bathing Beauty, or something like that.
It would be like the Miss Bikini or Miss
Miss
Swimsuit
Bikini,
model.
exactly. So all the girls were wearing bikinis. It was sponsored by Nivea, the Nivea beauty cream, and they kind of local fashion houses, which were obviously very central to Egyptians' economy because of the cotton trade, were kind of looking for models to wear their outfits, and that was all part of the sort of marketing campaigns for enhancing the sales of Egyptian cotton. But so there was, on the one hand, there's a really rather prestigious and national event called the Miss Egypt beauty competition, and on the other hand, there's the Bathing Beauties, where the girls are only wearing bikinis. In the Miss Egypt contest, the women parading are wearing long, classy, covering dresses, which were intended to favor modesty and encourage any nationality to participate, including Arab women who were perhaps understood from Western perspective to be more modest than them. So wearing long dresses was absolutely necessity for the Miss Egypt competition. Dalida didn't win, or from my understanding, even participate in Miss Egypt. But later on in France, this story of having once been a beauty queen followed her. And not just music, so journalists would be curious to know, so what prize did you win? You were a beauty in Egypt. Is it Miss Egypt? And in fact, a couple of times, and I've got sort of archives to demonstrate this, which I mentioned in my book on Dalida, it's often French journalists who volunteer in their interview with her the title of Miss Egypt, because they understand the concept of Miss Nation. They know Miss France, they know Miss America, and they say, oh, so you won a beauty contest. Was it Miss Egypt? And she says yes. But there's a very interesting interview on French state radio, France Inter, dating from 1970. An interviewer called Jacques Chancel, who had a very long, illustrious career as a news and cultural anchor for French radio. She hesitates in her answer. She says, yes, no, oui, non, mais en fait. She's kind of saying, yes, I won a prize. It was a beauty prize, but it was not Miss Egypt. But if it's simple for you, if you prefer me to say yes to that question, and let's just say it was Miss Egypt. And from there, from 1970, basically, in the French media, it becomes a simplifying identity that is easier to carry, that doesn't need explaining. If you have to say, I won Bathing Beauty in my bikini, sounds a bit naff. And whereas I was Miss Egypt, nobody's going to verify. And it sounds like she's on a destiny for great things. Like already back in 1954, she had already won a massively prestigious prize. And that is there's a kind of implied logic for her success later on. But in fact, it's a historical discourse that unfolds gradually.
Yeah. In your writings, you've talked this idea about sort of a global star versus a transnational star. Can you help me understand the difference? Why Dalida was a transnational star but not a global one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we talk about a global star, we want to say that a star is known throughout the globe, throughout the world, and often this is led by an American understanding of success, because the power, economic, cultural, prestigious power of the United States has really shaped popular culture around the world in the second half of the 20th century. Dalida is not a global star in the sense that she's virtually an unknown in the Anglophone world. There are only very few traces of her passage and kind of legacy in the United States or in Britain. She never performed live in the UK. She performed live at the Carnegie Hall once in 1978 in front of a predominantly French expat audience. And she did tour Canada a couple of times, but mainly Quebec, the French-speaking part. She only recorded an EP with 4 tracks in English. That was in the late 50s when they were trying to, Barclay was trying to get her to have this transatlantic dimension. But really, she was busy enough in Europe, in the Middle East, in North Africa. She was already touring 250 days a year on stage and going from studio to television to a concert. And her life seems to have been a relentless, exhausting schedule of events, of professional commitments. So why also bother with an Anglophone career when you don't need one?
Yeah.
But in that way, I think she's not a global star. But she's transnational, absolutely. And I think that means that you can cross national boundaries physically to travel. She was lucky enough to get a French passport from 1960-61 when she married, in fact, Lucien Maurice, the co-director of Europe 1. So through marriage, she became French. But also, the adjective transnational refers to an idea of discrepancy between national contexts, that you can have a particular kind of success in France, which has its own set of meanings and values and recognition, and have a different kind of success once you have crossed the boundary. You've gone across to another environment. So, for instance, Lebanon or Egypt or even Italy. And her success, to me, is transnational in a sense that we need to stay mindful of these discrepancies of scale between how big she is in France and how little well-known she is in England, for instance. And how absolutely emotional many Lebanese people get from those I have met and interviewed who say, "Oh, Dalida, wonderful." But will react very differently from Italian listeners or French ones in that respect. So she's transnational because of variations of in her success and her meanings.
Yeah. There's like a prism through which you see her.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder what the relationship Egyptian media and Egyptians, I should say, what Egyptian media and Egyptians had with her throughout the 70s and 80s to today. I mean, was she considered this like hometown hero who made it big? Or was it like, well, you sort of turned your back on us and we don't want to claim you?
So I must confess, I haven't got the tools to answer that question properly. I am not an Arabic speaker, and I was not able for my project to travel to Egypt and access archives. So the archives I've got about Egypt reception of her career only date from 1986, once she did the lead role in a film by Youssef Chahine. And Chahine is obviously one of the best-known film directors of Egypt with a transnational career, often getting co-productions, for instance, with French producers for his films. So I can talk about her reception in 1986 when she played the role of Sadiqa in The Sixth Day. But I'm afraid I can't really say much about her reception in Egypt during the 60s, 70s, and it's a real gap in my knowledge.
Let's talk about Shaheen. So that film comes out. She plays an elderly woman. She's not the young starlet. Tell us a little bit about the film and the reception.
Yeah. So the film is very strange. Shaheen is a very ambitious film director who has turned his hands to all sorts of different genres, basically. And with this film, he primarily did a literary adaptation. So The Sixth Day is the film adaptation of a novel of the same name, published in French in 1960 but published, set in Egypt, and written by an Egyptian-born novelist, André Chedid. André Chedid was born in Egypt, then moved to Lebanon at some point, and then did the majority of her career in France, in French, but often reminiscing about events, life, and imagining life in her native Egypt. So the novel, The Sixth Day, is an incredibly tragic, awful reading experience because it follows this grandmother, Sadiqa, who is trying to flee the city, Cairo, or I think Alexandria, actually. I think it takes place on the... sorry, all of a sudden I'm unsure. Would have to verify that.
Yeah.
But there's cholera. It's undated. We don't really know when the story is set, but it's a story of a pandemic and a ravage that humans try to control and can do nothing about. It's pure despair as a book. And the grandson of Sadiqa has caught the cholera. She's trying to hide this reality from the local nurse. And she leaves the city and tries to find a space on a boat to go down the river and escape the city with her grandson. And on the sixth day, she hopes for a rebirth, that the cholera will pass and the son will fine, but he dies. An incredibly tragic book. But Shaheen thought it was a wonderful book. And he wanted to adapt it. And he proposed it to Dalida, who said she was already familiar with the novel, with the work of André Chedid, and felt pleased and gratified that somebody was taking her acting skills seriously and offering her a serious and rather somber role. However, Shaheen also turned the film into a homage to Hollywood musicals and Gene Kelly. So it's trying to do two very different things at once.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of very minor character in the novel who's turned into a very prominent, lively, clownish young man who always walks around with a little monkey on a chain. And he's much younger than Dalida, and he lusts after her. He falls in love with her. He pursues her of his sexual longing. And this is kind of very strangely juxtaposed with musical numbers, with the really tragic cholera story that is going on. So the film, in fact, lacked coherence for the majority of viewers. And it was a flop in Egypt. And it was a flop commercially in France. But it was a critical success in France, but not so much a critical success in Egypt. From what I could read, a lot of Egyptian critics felt two problems with the film. One was that Dalida was too coquettish, too pretty, too well-known as a star to be cast in this role of an anonymous Arab woman wearing quite drab black clothing with a veil. Sometimes she even has a sort of niqab on her face and a face veil and a hair covering, but she still wears a lot of makeup. And it's Dalida, you can recognize her. So Egyptian critics felt that she was miscast. And they also felt that the film was just not working. It was too much conflicting between the sort of sexual passion, the tap dancing musical numbers, and the tragic plot.
تعبان من كتر اللعب ما فيكش حاجة ارجع بعد شوية سعيد نايم تعبان.
Can I ask you a question, Mikey? What do you think she sounds like in Arabic? Does she sound like an authentic speaker? Some people have
okay. I was going to say that she sounds. I mean, her Egyptian is, I mean, so native. It's obvious that she grew up there. It's obvious. It does not sound like an Italian person or French person speaking Arabic. To me, Egyptians who are listening to this, please correct me. But to me, it sounds very, very, very native. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of her flexibility in terms of the way she, as an artist and as a performer, and her relationship to the Arab world and her relationship to Europe, and sort of the way that that can kind of pivot. So you had sent me earlier a few songs, or two versions of the same song. And I'm just going to cue you up to tell a little bit about the story, set the scene, how she recorded these two different versions and why it's meaningful.
So Salma Ya Salama is Dalida's first recording in Arabic in 1977. And in France, just within a few weeks apart, they released two versions of the same track. One bilingual, French and Arabic. That was the first one. So it's mainly the choruses in Arabic. And then another completely in Arabic. So Salma Ya Salama exists in two versions, both recorded by Dalida the same year, in 77. She turned to Arabic for different reasons. Affective pleasure, exploring that part of her upbringing, being in Egypt, and showing a sense of respect, enjoyment, and pleasure with the Arabic language. But also, it was very strategic on the part of her producer, who by then was her younger brother, Orlando. He was very much aware that the Arabic pop music market was accelerating. In the 70s, in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Egypt as well, you had a lot of cassettes. So cassette was the kind of new modern way to listen to music. And cassettes could be played while in public transport, on the bus, in taxis. And that was a big way to disseminate pop music there, rather than relying on people buying albums. And they released Salma Ya Salama on cassette for the Egyptian market in particular. But her music as well, I mean, Dalida had already been broadcast and her records sold throughout the Middle East and Egypt. And especially since 1972 or 73, France opened a pan-Arab radio. There was a French state-led broadcasting service from Cyprus. And in Cyprus, the purpose of that radio, the company managing the radio was called Somera or Someka. Very fine as Somera, I think. They wanted to, in a way, I suppose, influence Middle Eastern listeners, or at least create a sense that France is a legitimate broadcaster of news and music and all sorts of radio services for listeners in the Middle East. So her songs had already been, songs not in Arabic, had already been broadcast a lot to the Middle East since the early 70s. So in a way, turning to Arabic is only the sort of logical step in that direction of courting Arabic listeners. But as a song, Salma Ya Salama, I think, is incredibly successful and incredibly powerful for symbolizing a gesture of openness. And like I was saying earlier, of a kind of bringing together a sense of mutual respect, of putting as equivalent within a song, within a 3-minute package, the language of French and the Arabic language. And Dalida is the person, she's the mediator who can make the two work together. And it's very interesting that many other French pop singers who were also born like her in Egypt, in Alexandria, like Moustaki, or in Cairo, like Gibea, and Claude François in Ismailia, never turned to the Arabic language in their music career. These people, Gibea, Claude François, were huge stars in France in the 70s, and they had no interest in recording in Arabic. And Dalida did. And I think she was unique in that respect. Sadly, also, she was a bit of an outlier. She didn't kickstart a fashion for pop songs in France and in Arabic. We had to wait for a very different generation of North African post-colonial French people to kind of engage with the Arabic language and become successful. So that would be a lot later, like in the 1990s, especially with a band called Zebda, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But she was, in a way, an iconoclast. She was unique, original, and powerful in the late 70s, especially in 77 with Salma Ya Salama, in doing that binding.
So there's a geopolitical context to this, right? So what is the geopolitical context? Why she first wrote and published this piece?
Well, the why, I'm not too sure, but we have the piece, it exists, and now we've got lots of events kind of surrounding the release and the uses of that song. And in particular, on 19 November 1977, the song Salma Ya Salama, in the Dalida version, but I was unable to establish whether it was the bilingual French-English version or the fully Arabic one, but one of these versions, which in any way has some Arabic in it, was broadcast in Jerusalem to welcome the Egyptian president, Anwar al-Sadat, when he came to pay a visit to Israel. It was the first time that a leader of an Arab nation was visiting Israel since its creation in 1948. This is a huge deal for the Middle East. It's hugely problematic for those Arab countries that felt that Israel was an enemy and we should not even try to befriend it. But Egypt, or Sadat at the time, was very important in warming up the relations between Israel and the Arab world, or on behalf of the Arab world with Egypt in particular. And 18 months later, in 1979, we've got the Camp David peace agreements. So, which are, I suppose, a good story for Egypt, but hugely problematic for the rest of the Arab world. But,
and for Egyptians.
Yes, as well. Absolutely. So Dalida's music has been, in a way, instrumentalized to play the part of peacekeeping and to triangulate a political relationship, which perhaps otherwise, without her presence as a non-Arab Egyptian, might not have been possible. Or perhaps we are giving a bit too much weight to what is just a song. But I find it hugely interesting that this closeness of Israel and Egypt is symbolically and culturally facilitated with a piece of music that is actually recorded in Paris with a French star who can sing in Arabic but is not herself Arab, but yet because of that gesture symbolizes dialogue, symbolizes the possibility of cosmopolitan, mutual, international understanding. Why not choose a song by Kulthum? But no, she's too nationalist. So it couldn't have been. It would have been too antagonistic towards Israel to choose that kind of artist. Yeah. So yeah,
it's interesting because you mentioned this earlier, but Dalida was not a Hebrew speaker, right?
No.
It's bizarre that she published so many songs in Hebrew.
No, it's not bizarre. It's only two. It's Hava Nagila in 1959, and later on, 65 maybe, definitely before the 6 Days War, another one called Henemato. Right. It's not unusual because Hava Nagila was already part of a sort of international cosmopolitan repertoire when performed in the United States by Harry Belafonte. He's a Black American, and he had a career very much like Dalida in a way in the 50s in the United States as somebody who indifferently symbolizes for a majority white United States audience the idea of fluidity, the idea of multi-ethnicity. He would sing songs that reference Brazil, reference the Bahamas, reference lots of things. And he had already, 6 months before Dalida, put Havana Gila on his in his repertoire. So I think it's absolutely logical for her producer at the time in France, who are keeping a very close eye to what's going on in the United States and what is successful, to say, why not add Hebrew to our playlist, basically? Especially since in the late 50s, if we're in 59 in France, the French are at war with Algeria. The FLN is fighting with weapons that are transiting through Egypt. Egypt is backing the FLN against France. So singing in Hebrew is logical from the perspective of dominant white colonial culture. For Hindemakov,
it was like almost like a litmus test.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Salma Ya Salama. I'm going to play a little bit of it. So that's the mixed one.
That's the mixed one, yeah. I'll say a word later on about the video. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, let's play the fully Arabic one just for context. Okay, so I'm not a musicologist. I am a musician. I'm not a musicologist. I would be very curious to people who are listening to this. To me, the melody here is a very strange choice, a melody. This was composed for her, correct?
No, so the chorus is a folkloric Egyptian song, I think associated with Nile sailors. And it's meant to evoke, maybe to facilitate rowing and to sort of build a sort of cyclical, repetitive gesture to using your boat on the River Nile. It's a very old folkloric tune. Is that what you're recognizing?
It's surprising to me. So I was curious if it was written for her or not. I want to play that. So you want to tell me about the music video before I play one more song?
Yes, maybe, because what we saw in a sort of music video of that song with Dalida singing the stanzas in French of Salma Ya Salama was shot in Paris, in the Great Mosque of Paris. So it's in the 5th arrondissement, and so it's a beautiful place with gardens and a cafe area. It's a gorgeous a place for everybody to visit, really. And it was founded in France in the early 20s as a gesture of friendship between Morocco and France. And also the existence itself of the Great Mosque in Paris, I think, is a powerful sign of, in a way, the welcome presence of Arabs and Muslims in France. They have a mosque, at least in the capital city, and many more since elsewhere. But it's important to say that France also welcomes its Muslim and Arab population. And choosing to go in the mosque in 1977 for a pop music video, in a way, can both be seen as a exoticizing gesture. It's in Arabic, let's just find an Arabic setting and we find the mosque. But it's also, I think, a powerful symbol that it's fine to be Arab or to multiply identities and to be French and Arab at once. That's the one thing. But the film also is a scopitone. So it's not a music video that was meant for television. It was recorded in 16mm color film, meant for a jukebox machine called a scopitone. And virtually it's a machine that was completely on the wane at the time. Very few cafes and casinos had them anymore, but especially Maghrebi cafes in Paris had these old devices where you could play a music video, Scopiton, for a couple of francs, and watch, instead of watching on telly or listening on radio, you had in a collective environment of the cafe a place where you could play a track. So it's not just the music jukebox, it's a video jukebox. And I think it's also a gesture for the North African audiences of Paris, mainly Paris, because there were not many Scopiton elsewhere. So that's what I wanted to say as well, that
Interesting.
the song had a powerful sentimental role because it could be used by North African audiences.
Okay, I want to play Helwa Ya Baladi to close on, because to me it signifies this song came out a year later. Oh, before I say that, I wanted to correct myself. So the last song, Salma Ya Salama, is actually a Sayyid Darwish song from almost 100 years or 70 years beforehand. So I got that wrong. And I'm glad I'm glad that we corrected that. Helwa Ya Baladi, a year later comes out, which to me is so interesting because it's such a national identity song. It sounds like it's like almost like pan-Arab in some ways. And it's interesting that it comes from somebody like her who was not publishing in Arabic for so long. To me, this song is like the diasporic anthem. This is like the anthem of every Arab diaspora. It's interesting that she publishes this song.
Yes, but it is an anthem exactly for anyone who understands the Arabic language and feels a sense of homeland in an Arabophone environment, because the key word baladi just means country. It is unspecified. And the very abstraction of the lyrics lend it a universal capacity to signify something, to signifying home or land or country or nation or defiance. Quite powerful ideas that you can put under that term of the country. So it has a long legacy, partly because the political history of many Arab countries is so complex, but also because as a pop song, it's so efficient at conveying simple and deep emotions with just the simplest of terminology. Baladi. My country. Which country? It doesn't matter. It's any country. And the listener will fill in the specifics. Or not need specifics to feel aroused by a track like this.
Can we come to try to end this interview with almost a very sad ending to her life? I never knew that she struggled with depression. This was something that was new to me. But maybe tell us a little bit about the last few years of her life. She died so young.
Yeah, she committed suicide in May 1987. She was just 54. She had been suffering from depression for many years. And the first serious onset of depression came in 1967, 20 years before, when her boyfriend at the time committed suicide. She found his body. He shot himself in a hotel, and she found his body. And that led to a really deep spiral of despair. And only, in fact, 6 weeks after finding him dead back then in 1967, she attempted suicide. And at the time, already the French media were, in a way, incredibly violent and voyeuristic in kind of mediatizing that story of tragedy, because who doesn't like a star who suffers? So Paris Match, for instance, did a big front cover and double-page spread about her in hospital recovering from that initial suicide attempt. Really vicious reporting, I feel. But from there as well, so Dalida also eventually committed suicide. And I'm very ambivalent about this because, well, I don't have to judge, but she didn't write her autobiography. She didn't write the lyrics of the song. Very often in interviews, she's very happy to go with the flow, to stay in her lane. She's incredibly docile. And if the journalists are taking her down a particular path, and she accepts, and she didn't resist or appear to resist. And in a way, one of the greatest gesture of resistance, we've got to be careful, it is suicide. It's not really a sign of agency. It's a sign of powerlessness. But it is ambivalent in a sense that it is something she did for herself. And we've got to really respect that in a way. And for me, as well as a cultural historian of music discourses in France, I feel that Dalida, throughout her lifetime, really, really suffered from enormous contempt from the music establishment. And it's something that her death cancelled, and her death posthumously. She's been working ever so hard through re-releases of her music, through new artists duetting, covering her music. And there's been a real reappraisal of her contribution, at least to French music culture. And now she is prestigious. Just only this week, a couple of days ago, there was a big 3-hour event on French television, France 2, a big emission of homage to Dalida. I mean, it's every year, on television, the last 20 years, there's been homages to her. There's a statue and a square bearing her name in Paris. There's loads of official praise and official prestige, but she didn't have critical prestige during her lifetime. She had popular success, but it's very different.
Yeah. Barbara, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. You've been so generous with your time, so thanks so much.
My pleasure. Shukran.